Hello, everyone. Welcome to ConnectCon, presented by FTC Team 9794, Wizards.exe. Join us on our magical journey each month where you can hear from STEM professionals from Google, APL, iRobot, and more. My name is Miriam Simpson-Remus, and I will be your host for this session. Today, in addition to the presentation, we have some exciting giveaways from Govilda. Please use the Google form in the YouTube description to enter a giveaway for a $50 stored chat and type the code ConnectCon in the chat for a chance to win a Go Build a t-shirt, for which you will have an increased chance at winning if you're subscribed to our YouTube channel. We will also be offering some store credit and a hat at the end, so be sure to stay on the stream. Also, please use the chat for any questions related to the presentation and we'll address them at the end. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Mary Armstrong Hough and Dr. Mariela Alfonzo from the University of New York speak about working as a team in the sciences, specifically public health. Dr. Armstrong Hough is an epidemiologist and Dr. Alfonzo is an engineer, and they have been working collaboratively during this pandemic. Thank you so much for taking the time to present at ConnectCon.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for that introduction, and thank you to the entire Wizards team for having us today. And we're really excited to talk with you about sort of our career trajectories in STEM and how our really, really different types of expertise can come together to improve public health, which is something that I think we're all more aware than ever is an important goal. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, Miriam, will you nod if you can see that? Great, thank you. So our theme today is teaming up for public health. And the idea here is that public health is a field, it's an objective, but it's not really a discipline. It's actually an area of study and an area of practice where people with lots of different types of expertise, largely in STEM, but also in communications and policy and a lot of other areas, sort of come together to try to work towards a single goal. And so what we're going to do today is first I'm going to talk through the who, what, where, why of my career, how I became an epidemiologist, what that actually means, what on earth we do from day to day. And then I'm going to give some examples of teaming up for public health. After that, we'll do the giveaway. Miriam will handle the giveaway in the middle. And then Dr. Alfonzo is going to take over and talk about sort of her trajectory, the who, what, where, why of her career. And we're going to conclude with talking about some of the opportunities that we found to team up together for public health in the time of COVID. So first, the who. As Miriam said, my name is Mary Armstrong Hough. I'm an epidemiologist of lung health based at NYU, where I am an assistant professor. And my research focuses on how infectious diseases and non-infectious diseases, non-communicable diseases, interact to produce patterns of transmission and clinical outcomes. And so, what that means is my work is really looking at how diseases that can be transmitted from person to person, like tuberculosis, HIV, and COVID-19, interact with diseases like diabetes, cardiovascular diseases that are more and more common in populations around the world. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the interface of these diseases is actually really meaningful on both sides. So for example, people living with HIV are about 20 times as likely to develop active tuberculosis. So that's two infectious diseases that constitute a co-epidemic. They tend to occur together. But people who are living with HIV, who are also taking antiretroviral therapy in order to control their HIV, they are also at higher risk of developing certain non-communicable diseases like diabetes or risk factors like hypertension. And those non-communicable diseases also put them at higher risk than for other infectious diseases like TB. So people who have diabetes are more likely to develop active tuberculosis. And people who have tuberculosis and diabetes, even though they seem like they might be two totally different diseases, people who have TB and diabetes are actually about 3 times as likely to die during TB treatment as those who don't have diabetes. So there are all these sort of intersections in terms of clinical outcomes among non-communicable diseases. Sometimes people call those lifestyle diseases, and these communicable diseases that we think about all the time, like HIV, COVID-19, and TB. But there's also differences potentially in patterns of transmission, because certain non-communicable diseases can make us more vulnerable to infection or more vulnerable to the severe progression of disease, or more vulnerable to treatment non-response. Like it can take us longer to respond to antibiotics or antivirals. That can also potentially change the transmission dynamics for these infectious diseases. So that's sort of what my work is about in terms of research. But I actually get asked a lot, what do you do? Like what do you do from day to day? And I have a hard time explaining this to people because actually I do a lot of things. And this picture here is a picture of me reviewing a patient register at a TB clinic in Uganda, which is one of the major places where I work. And this is one of the things that I do. Before COVID, I spent at least 3 months a year, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, actually visiting the sites where we collect data, where we enroll patients. So I do things that involve actually being at those sites. But then I also do a lot of other things, both in New York City, where I'm based, and abroad. So in theory, what epidemiologists do is study the distribution and the determinants of disease. So we're interested in who in a population has disease and why they have disease. And we use that knowledge to prevent or control diseases. And there are a lot of different kinds of epidemiologists. I think that this is something that we're more and more aware of now because of COVID. There are more epidemiologists in the news. And most of those epidemiologists are infectious disease epidemiologists. And that's actually what my training is in. I was trained in the epidemiology of microbial diseases department. So my sort of main training in epi is really about transmission dynamics and infectious diseases. But actually, a lot of epidemiologists focus on other things. They focus on non-communicable diseases. They focus on social determinants of health and disease. And so, they're not so much interested in transmission dynamics as they are interested in patterns of risk factors for certain diseases. And so different kinds of epidemiologists who are focused on different kinds of conditions sometimes can use very, very different methods. Even if they're using quantitative methods, they'll use very different types of quantitative methods. But our overarching goal is always to use the knowledge that we produce to prevent disease from happening, or, as in the case of COVID-19, to try to start to provide potential tools, mitigation techniques, and knowledge that will help us control diseases that are moving through a population. So how does that translate into day-to-day life? This is actually the first time that I tried to sit down and list off all the things that I do from week to week. But a research epidemiologist, who's at the PhD level, so not MPH, is going to do things like plan studies, plan trials. Most of my work takes place through randomized controlled trials. It's a very specific study design where we test an intervention against a control or a standard of care. I run a lab that has students, trainees, and staff. I consult with clinicians. I draw a lot of DAGs. These are directed acyclic graphs, and I'll show you an example of one later in my talk. I code in Stata, in SAS, and in R to analyze data. Most of the time I'm analyzing data. Rarely I'm doing mathematical modeling, which is to say doing forecasting. I write articles. I've written a book. I speak at conferences and research centers to communicate this work. I travel to my international sites to collect data, to train staff, and to work with my collaborators in Uganda, South Africa, and elsewhere. I teach graduate students, and I advise decision makers. So, my work from day to day might vary from what's pictured here, which is, you can barely see him, that's our laboratory coordinator, Emma, in Kampala, Uganda, in one of the labs at a public sector clinic that we work out of there. Doing actual study design. This is us planning a trial in Kampala now it's summer before last because of COVID. But this is a cardiologist from Makerere University in Kampala, two of my former colleagues from Yale, who are both physicians. One is a rheumatologist, another is an emergency medicine physician. And in this case, we're actually looking at qualitative data. We're looking at excerpts from interviews as we're trying to plan this trial, because we're trying to anticipate all the potential threats to the validity of our study design, and all the potential threats to the generalizability, or what we call the external validity of our study design. So we actually look at qualitative data in order to try to plan a quantitative study. My work involves a lot of travel. Before COVID, I traveled internationally to a study site about once a month. It involves actually being at the study sites. This is a picture from one of the hospitals that we work with in rural Uganda, where I get to go and actually check the registers and check on data collection, work together with our collaborators there to understand what the barriers to data collection may be, and make sure that the data are structured in such a way that when we get to the end of data collection, I'm actually going to be able to apply knowledge from biostatistics to analyze it and come up with an answer that makes sense, produce actionable knowledge. Even when I'm within country, there's a lot of travel. And I included this picture because you can see that myself and there's a social scientist sitting next to me whose knee you see, named Joseph Gita. I publish with him very frequently. And we have our laptops open because I'm working on a manuscript and he's working in, I think probably Stata. So he's running chi-square tests, looking at preliminary data, and I have a document open writing an article, and we're bumping along in the car as we go, because sometimes it takes 2 hours to get somewhere, and so we just have to work as we go. Sometimes there are traffic jams. This is in the upcountry, and it is the main cause of traffic jams in rural Uganda. And occasionally, very occasionally, we have to actually hike to one of our study sites. So this is a study site for a different project in rural Ethiopia. You can see a few of my colleagues ahead of me in their packs. We had to hike up the mountain to get to it. A lot of my work looks like this. I have our studio open, or SAS or Stata, and I'm looking at code. I'm trying to figure out how to make sense of the patterns and the data that we've collected. And this is, I promised you a picture of a DAG. A lot of it then is working with colleagues on a whiteboard or on paper, on Zoom or in person, trying to come up with a conceptual model of the relationships among our variables. We call these directed acyclic graphs, and they're meant to aid us as we start to form statistical models or statistical models to understand the relationships among different variables. So this is one of our early DAGs for mediation analysis that I'll talk about later. And we draw these out to try to understand, what our hypotheses are about the causal relationships between these variables so that we can carry out something called causal mediation analysis in order to identify patterns. And then finally, when all of that is done, I get to communicate the results. So this is in the World TB meetings last fall, where I presented on some of our spatial analyses of the behavior of people who are at risk of TB in Uganda, whether or not when referred for TB evaluation, they actually go and complete their diagnostic tests. We also communicate our ideas, of course, in articles and increasingly in preprints, which are not reviewed by our peers. So they're not so sure, they're not so polished. We shouldn't weight them as much, but they're a really good, fast way for us to get some of our findings out there. I do this in a lot of different places. This is actually an old map. I'm missing a study site in Vietnam on it. But my work in the last few years has been centered mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, a little bit in Japan. I have one project in Vietnam. And then now because of COVID, I have all of these sites that are in the United States. And I'll tell you a little bit about that project shortly. So just a couple pictures of what this looks like. This is a picture of rural Ethiopia. Some of my sites are urban, some are rural, some are really, really rural. But what they all have in common is that they are places where certain respiratory diseases are endemic, are really, really common. And the main disease that I work on is tuberculosis. Now, until about 2 weeks ago, tuberculosis was the #1 infectious disease killer. It kills about 4,000 people a day. Killed 4,000 people today. It killed 4,000 people yesterday. It's going to kill 4,000 people tomorrow. That's been going on for years. So tuberculosis is really sort of the global plague, and that's what most of my research has been on. Tuberculosis, however, is pretty uncommon in the United States nowadays because of improved nutrition, because of really good public health mitigation, and because of the fact that we can treat to prevent TB, which is to say that we can offer medications to treat not only people who have active TB, but even those people who've been just simply exposed to TB infection. It's something that we've really been able to bring under control in the United States. So there's not very much TB in the United States. It's limited to some, people living with HIV are at higher risk, people who live in prisons and injection drug users. But of course, what happened 2 weeks ago was that COVID surpassed for the first time TB as the #1 cause of death from a single infectious agent. And COVID is now killing about 4,000 people a day, about a quarter of whom are in the United States. So it's a real reversal of the focus of my work. All of a sudden, the #1 infectious disease agent killing people is actually active right here in my home community. This is a picture of my very messy office in New York at NYU. I don't know about Dr. Alfonzo. I don't have a window. I'm in a really, really tall building, but I'm on the inside of the building. I don't have a window. So I mentioned that my work has shifted to be much more US focused. These are just my main US study sites right now for the COVID ICU study. So why? Why do this? Why did I become an epidemiologist? This is something that Dr. Alfonzo and I were actually talking about a little bit before we came on here, and she actually said something that I thought was really interesting. That she's really driven by the question, not by like the methods necessarily. The methods are sort of a means to understand how to build better and healthier and more engaging cities. And I realize that that's really true for me as well, and probably for most epidemiologists. We're a really mission-driven science. I decided to do this because I find it morally compelling. I didn't decide to do this because I thought the hours were great. The hours are terrible. But I am sort of inspired to get up and keep doing it every day because in the end, the goal is for fewer people to die of a preventable and treatable disease. That's the goal. That's how I know if my colleagues and I have been successful at the end of the year. We look at those WHO numbers. 2 years ago, 1.7 million people died of TB. Last year, 1.5 million people died of TB. Like we won 200,000 lives. And so that's really what drives me here. And what that means is that, the methods are incredibly central in epidemiology, but when you meet epidemiologists, we often use many different methods. We're sort of polyglots, or maybe polymaths when it comes to methods, because again, we're really interested in getting the answer to the question. And sometimes we'll hoard many different analytic methods, quantitative or qualitative, in order to get there. So how I got here through a lot of school. I actually originally trained as a medical sociologist, during which I had about 2 years of graduate training in statistics, which was really helpful later. But I went out into the world and I realized that was not what I wanted to do. I was really inspired by the idea of working in epidemiology and the idea of working in something that allowed me to do so many different things over the course of the day. Because again, epidemiologists are really sort of jacks of all trades. You have to know a little bit of biology and a little bit of sociology and a fair amount of math. You have to work with colleagues from a lot of different fields. And I realized that was something that I was going to find really exciting, this opportunity to use applied analytic methods that come from statistics and from epi, but in a real world setting. So I actually, after I got my PhD, went to graduate school the first time, I went back to graduate school a second time in applied biostatistics and epidemiology. And that, by the way, these are some actual notes from graduate school. These are some books from one of my semesters in graduate school. There really is a lot of school involved in this. And, let me tell you, I wasn't always great at it. I'm showing you right now, I found this old assignment on which I got a 10 out of 15 in graduate school. This was from my first semester of quantitative methods in epidemiology, which was a mathematical modeling class. And, I wasn't I didn't just get this the first time. I sometimes got it the third time or the fifth time, the 20th time. But it took a lot of practice to get here. And, one of the things that's very common in our field is that you also do a lot of post-school training. So even after you finish graduate school, after you finish your PhD, you basically apprentice in someone else's lab. So I spent 3 years in the lab of Dr. Luke Davis at Yale School of Public Health in the Department of Epidemiology and Microbial Diseases, essentially, learning how to do this, learning how to build a lab and do this sort of work. And I had a lot of really amazing, great mentors along the way. So now we've gotten to what I think is the most important part of this. I've answered who, what, where, why. But to me, the most important question is with whom? With whom do I do this work? Because no epidemiologist works alone. And indeed, almost no one in science ever works alone now. We're all working together as interdisciplinary teams. So I work with a lot of different types of clinicians. I work with biostatisticians, with social scientists, and lots of different kinds of trainees. You're seeing pictured here 2 of my current trainees, one of whom is a medical student at Yale, the other of whom is in the first year of his residency in Uganda. He's a graduate of Makerere University there. And, these are often really delightful people to work with because they're early in their career, they're still in their training, but they're still, really smart people who sometimes have the most exciting ideas because they haven't become too narrow yet and too focused on their own discipline. But even when I'm not working with trainees, I think the biggest takeaway from my work is that it takes a lot of different kinds of expertise to produce usable knowledge in public health. This is a team that I work with. You saw these people at the beginning of my talk when you saw us planning a trial. This trial is now mostly planned, and it's an emergency medicine physician and an infectious disease and NCD epidemiologist and a professor of internal medicine and a rheumatologist. and it takes, all of us plus actually a whole lot of other people together in a room just to plan a single trial. So just to give you one example of what this looks like, I thought that I would spend, hopefully just 3 minutes talking about one of my current studies in the United States. This is called the Precipice Study. And the background for this was, back in the spring, I was emailing with a number of my colleagues who are pulmonologists and critical care physicians. And at that time, they were experiencing the first surge of COVID-19 patients who had experienced respiratory failure and been moved into the ICU. And one of the things that we started talking about was that now ICUs were full of patients who were from racial or ethnic minorities, and those patients are actually twice as likely to develop respiratory failure compared to white patients in the United States. And there's many reasons for that reflect sort of systems of inequality in this country to which people are subjected their entire lives. But one of the things that we started thinking about then was, are any of these inequalities, are any of these disparities actually being introduced during the course of critical care? Are there care processes in ICUs that are either differentially distributed to minority patients or have differences in their outcomes among minority patients? And can we identify those? And so, this was something we got really passionate about. A colleague of mine named Tom Valley, who's a critical care physician at University of Michigan, an assistant professor there as well. And I started talking this out. We started drawing the DAG that you see on the right side of your screen. So again, this is one of these directed acyclic graphs. And the way to read this is sort of broadly from left to right. That's the direction in which causality flows. And we put this together as sort of a map of what we thought the important sort of mediators were that might explain the differences that we were seeing in survival outcomes of respiratory failure associated with COVID-19. And we started to identify specific care processes. So we reached out to the Society for Critical Care Medicine, and ultimately we've now been chosen as an ancillary study for one of their major prospective cohort studies called the virus registry. And this is giving us access to real patient level data from 226 ICUs across the country. So we have thousands and thousands and thousands of patients who've experienced respiratory failure as a result of COVID-19. And we have very detailed information about patient characteristics, but also about the clinical decision-making that went into those patients, what care processes were actually delivered to them and when, and then what their outcome was. Were they alive at discharge or were they dead at discharge? So this sounds in some ways like it wouldn't be that hard. I remember when we first got on the calls and began talking about this in the summer and planning the study, I was like, this is so elegant. It's a serious. There are 9 hypothesis tests here. These are what they are. And what we quickly realized is that it's not simple at all. And so the with whom becomes incredibly important. So who you're seeing here are sort of the main leadership team for the Precipice Study, which, by the way, has actually grown to have several other aims, and it's become quite large. But it started from that first research question. So Dr. Tom Valley, who is a pulmonary and critical care physician, and he also has expertise in clinical decision-making and in data science, actually. He's really a polymath. Dr. Stephanie Cook, who is an incredible biostatistician who works on understanding social determinants of health disparities. So she's used to working with really complex multi-level data. And then Dr. Jackie Washina, who's another critical care physician, but he's actually, in addition to being an MD, he's also a PhD. He does a ton of work on health policy. And then myself, coming from the intersection of infectious disease epidemiology and medical sociology. And so it takes the 4 of us really just to make up the leadership team. We made a list then, as we started to apply for funding of this, what are all the different types of expertise that are going to be required just to do this one project? And so again, just to answer that one question that I put out there, just to fill in the blanks on that one directed acyclic graph, graph rather. We need expertise in ICU research, expertise in disparities research, expertise in use of clinical data, multi-level modeling, mixed methods, qualitative research, intervention development, and intervention piloting. And so, it really takes a lot of different people from a lot of different fields to get there. So just so you see, I've shown you the leadership team, but in addition to that, there's actually other teams that have to work on this project. We have a national advisory board that has to advise the project that consists of physicians, of sociologists, of statisticians, and there's an implementation scientist on it, a methodologist, people to sort of advise the overall study. And I just want to brag for a second. One of the most amazing members of our advisory board, Dr. Marcela Nino-Smith, has just been chosen by the incoming Biden administration to be the co-chair of the COVID task force. So that is great news for all of us. So I think I just want to conclude, and before I hand over back to Miriam to do the giveaway and then on to Dr. Alfonzo, is I want to think about how we're better together. I think that one of the things that has been really exciting to me in my career in general has been the opportunity to work with people who come from really different levels of expertise. And when we started talking about doing this session, I immediately thought of Dr. Alfonzo, someone who I wanted to be paired with to do this session so that we could talk about things together. Because built environment is incredibly important for epidemiologists, but it's not something that we're very good at measuring. And it's actually not something we're very good at analyzing either, because that's not the skill set that we were given. But the built environment is this major determinant, this major risk factor for lung diseases. Built environments determine the spaces in which we spend most of our time. They determine our exposures to particulates and other types of indoor and outdoor air pollution. The built environment tends to shape how much time we spend and how risky that time is with others in terms of droplets and aerosols. The built environment, in a deeper way, shapes our level of physical activity and the safety of that physical activity, which over time can put us at risk for diabetes and hypertension and some of these other sort of non-communicable diseases that I talked about at the very beginning as being incredibly meaningful for our chances of becoming infected with something like tuberculosis and our chances of surviving it. So the built environment isn't just interesting for epidemiologists. It actually is sort of important data for us to collect. It's an incredibly important dimension of how we can come to understand and model risk for diseases, whether they be communicable or non-communicable. But we actually don't have great methods to quantify the built environment in epidemiology. And that is what Dr. Alfonzo's work has been really pioneering in. So I'm super excited that actually because of COVID, I actually met Dr. Alfonzo because of COVID and because we started to work on COVID intervention ideas together. But I'm just incredibly excited to do that because she fills in this huge knowledge gap, not only for me, but actually for a lot of people across my field. And we don't have time to go back to school for 20 years to develop the kind of expertise that she has, especially when we're responding to COVID. We got to do it right now. And so by actually meeting Dr. Alfonzo, we were able to save a ton of time and move forward and start coming up with ideas that were big and broad and interesting, but are also feasible because between the two of us, we actually have the resources to accomplish what we set out to accomplish. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Miriam and then to Dr. Alfonzo.
Yeah, so thank you for a wonderful start to our presentation. So it looks like the winner of our first giveaway is TDT 2845. Please email us to claim your t-shirt. We will have another store credit and a hat at the end, and the code for that giveaway is Go Builder. So I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Alfonzo to finish up our presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Miriam, and just amazing, Dr. Armstrong, to hear you kind of go through that. I knew some of it, but it's still fascinating to see. And thanks for the cue up for the built environment piece. So I will share my screen. Okay. So just one super quick clarification that I think is a really important one to make. I'm not an engineer. I do teach engineering students at University of New York, or NYU rather, at Tandon, which has always been kind of interesting to me, and you'll understand kind of why when I walk you through the career trajectory. So yeah, what I'm really going to be presenting today is kind of the why behind what I do. I think that kind of permeates all of the other who, what, how, and I guess where of what I do. I couldn't quite get to a rubric, just quite as straightforward as Dr. Armstrong, and I think you understand why, because the way that I kind of think about things is just naturally very transdisciplinary, and it's hard for me separately to kind of pull apart my passion from everything that I do, for better or worse. So I'll start with the story of kind of where I grew up. I grew up in Miami, Florida. And this is probably the image that, kind of pops to your mind when I say Miami, but this isn't the Miami that I grew up in. This is the Miami that I grew up in. And honestly, growing up here was terrifying as a pedestrian, and also just very uninspiring, to have this be the landscape that kind of you see and interact with on an everyday basis. And I even had a friend of mine who, at 15 years old, was crossing the street very similar to the one that I crossed on a very regular basis. And she was run over and killed by a driver. And so, for me, I think this had a big impact. I couldn't say that that's the reason when I was 15 that this is what I do, why I do what I do. But it definitely drove a lot of my passion around place, around the built environment, and how it shapes us. And in particular, I really wanted to be able to advocate for better places via data and evidence. And that's eventually what I did. Again, I had no idea at 15 that that's what I was going to do. In fact, I was always somebody who liked all the subjects in school. I liked math, I liked science, I liked history, I liked art. And I was fairly good, I think, at most of those. So it was really hard for me to figure out what do I do with my life? I love school, basically. So I kind of knew I wanted a PhD, because I was a big nerd all along. And also I grew up as the daughter of an immigrant single mom. So I felt like that was absolutely, I have to get the highest possible degree. So it was just, okay, what am I going to get a PhD in, right? So I started off actually very interested in psychology. I like to analyze things, and I felt that kind of touched upon a lot of the areas of interest that I had in terms of school subjects. But I was also very drawn to architecture and the design of cities, that tapped into history and design and science quite a bit. So I ended up actually majoring in psychology and then minoring in architecture, and then had I wouldn't say a midlife crisis because I was only 20 when I graduated undergrad. But, I really didn't know how to choose between these two seemingly completely different areas of study, right? And, my friends would joke with me like, oh, Mariela, you can just become a psychologist for architects, or you can design, houses for psychologists. And I was like, that's not very funny. I'm having a real crisis here. So, it's a funny story of how I ended up finding the field that actually combines these two disciplines. I ended up going to architecture school to pursue a master's for some time. But unlike Dr. Armstrong, I pulled out of that degree before I finished it because I felt like there was a component missing, and it was really the people component. And then I ended up working, because I had to pay the bills and I had to do something, at an advertising firm. And my very first day there, it was like, this is no good. This isn't for me. It wasn't, I thought I was going to be kind of creative or whatever. And they finished at 6, and I thought they finished at 5, and I started packing up at 4:45. I was like, what is this place? So I went on to Yahoo, because this was before Google, because I'm old. And I typed in psychology and architecture, and you never know what an internet search is going to do for you. So there you go. But I found this institute called the Environmental Design Research Association, and basically the rest is history. So, my trajectory started with, like I said, this kind of seemingly disparate career choices within University of Miami, which is where I went to undergrad. I was able to combine them via my PhD work at UC Irvine. And when I was at Irvine pursuing my PhD, I actually had the opportunity to get my master's as well. So the PhD program, you didn't need to kind of get a separate master's degree along the way. But I chose to give myself an additional burden of additional courses to get what's called the Masters of Urban Planning, not just because I'm a nerd, but that's part of it, but also because I felt that, it goes back to that why. Like, I didn't want to get a PhD for the reasons that most people get a PhD. I wanted just to be, sort of the highest level of expertise in my field. But I really wanted to be able to apply it to solve real urban problems and be on the ground doing that. And I wasn't convinced that what they call academia, they call the ivory tower, was the best way for me to do that. Dr. Armstrong does an amazing job of being able to actually apply her work. But in urban planning, I felt like they were quite divided. It was very theoretically driven. So I ended up going to Virginia Tech, and I did a postdoc there, and then stayed on for some time as a research fellow, and then ended up at NYU in 2011. It was like 2007, no, 2011. And so I'll kind of walk you through the course of the trajectory of the career and how it's ended up being essentially this bridge between academia and practice. So I mentioned, for me, I wanted to prove that design mattered using data and evidence. So that's really shaped the trajectory of everything I do, both from an academic standpoint and from a practice standpoint. And so what I really have focused on in terms of my work is really about the relationship between the built environment and behavior. And what's important to note about how design influences how we feel and what we perceive and how we interact with others, and even where we choose to live and shop, is that this is a two-way relationship, right? So design influences us and our behaviors, but we actually have the ability to shape our built environment. And this is an important concept, not just theoretically for academics, but also in practice, because we need to, as designers, allow for people to be able to move things around so that they can fit them in the right way. So even something as simple as having a bench or a chair be movable is an important concept that often doesn't get translated into the ground. And so this is one of the reasons why I always try to look at how these two things kind of interact. But the other thing I've focused on in my career is showing how all of this translates back to value, right? And I'm talking about economic value, although that's one of the things that I focus on, but really also about health value, both individual and sort of public health, and mental health. We also look at kind of the social value of places. We look even at the safety, because that can influence, the environments can influence crime and violence. We look at environmental quality, and then sort of the idea of mobility and traffic safety, which is what one of my original motivators was. So how have I done all of this stuff? So, Dr. Armstrong mentioned that my work is focused on quantifying urban design. So that was an important step in what I was trying to achieve, because I couldn't advocate for better urban design if I didn't measure what that was, right? And it's funny because the beginning of my career was completely tied into public health, with just kind of randomly, right? So I started working on a project almost my first day of grad school, looking at evaluating a safe routes to school legislative act that California had passed that had allowed for various interventions to be done around schools, so that parents would feel more comfortable allowing their children to go to school, but then also actually, of course, increase the safety. So you see that same relationship there: urban design, behavior, perceptions, and then value in terms of safety, right? So this was an early, very, very early concept that has kind of influenced my work of how do we measure this. So we started to look at sidewalks and bike lanes and things like that. And then after that, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is very focused on public health, they started to become aware of this link between the built environment and health. I wouldn't say become aware of it. It's been a tie for a very, very long time, actually. But they were very focused on this idea of obesity, diabetes, other chronic diseases that had to do with physical activity. And so they really wanted to be able to help create more of an evidence base around how does the built environment influence physical activity. So again, you're right that the public health folks don't generally touch upon built environment. So the very first step was, well, let's call upon our urban planning friends and have them help us create a tool by which to objectively measure variables of the built environment that we think could be influencing people's decisions to walk and ultimately these health outcomes. So that was the Irvine, Minnesota inventory, which is what you see a screenshot of here. And this project, unbeknownst to me when I was working on, shaped the trajectory of my career. So the other thing that I worked on throughout this work of thinking through kind of the built environment and how it influences us, I created this theory called the hierarchy of walking needs that really kind of pulled together this idea of, okay, let's measure built environment, but let's understand how the pathways by which the built environment influences us, and not just the behavioral outcomes, but what are the stuff in between? So like, what are the mediators that it's actually influencing our perceptions, and then that influence our behavior, right? Or what are things that are moderating this relationship? Does your sex influence how you think about a bench? I'm oversimplifying it, but so this was my first attempt at really kind of beginning to think through conceptually all the different aspects of our lives at different levels of analysis, like individually, socially, regionally, that would influence this relationship between urban design and behavior. So now I have this way to collect this data. I have all these hypotheses, but the problem is that I encountered is, what do we do with all of this data? So if I'm giving, Dr. Armstrong a huge list of 162 variables to measure about design, what is she going to do with that? She can't put 162 variables as independent variables. It just doesn't work that way mathematically. So that's actually where state of place comes in, which is where what my startup is called. So it's funny because this Irvine, Minnesota inventory, I said that it shaped the trajectory of my career. Well, I had actually started to use it in my own research. So by the time that different practitioners and other researchers came to me saying, what do we do with this tool? I had started to pull together essentially a mini index. I had only pulled about 50 of the 150 plus that were in the tool into a score, essentially, just to be able to say, hey, this place on the left, or this place on the left is located, rather, is scoring a lot more poorly than the place on the right. So this was actually for my dissertation research, which I'll show you a little bit more about in a second. And what's interesting about this is at the same time, and this really sparked my trajectory on the private sector side of what I do, the practice side, is that I met some renegades essentially at this conference called the Urban Land Institute. And so I had already begun to try to make inroads into more of the practice spheres and not only academic spheres. So I was at this conference and I met these guys, and they wanted to promote more walkability, livability in Houston. This was in 2005, and during that time, that was very early concept, a very hard sell for a place like Houston. Is very suburban and auto-dominated. So they brought me in, and I had to take that, very preliminary methodology that I created for my dissertation and somehow make this understandable to a lay audience. So very quickly I created a methodology, and now we gave it grades based off of the scores. And the idea was to kind of spur people to think about place and how it mattered and why it mattered. So this became eventually the State of Place Index. So now we could measure almost 300 different things. And of course, we pull this into a score. And then the score is actually broken down into different areas of urban design that you see here. So these are all things that we know from the evidence actually influence our behaviors and perceptions, so that it becomes a diagnostic tool to help people understand kind of what's working and what's not. The problem is that, okay, we've quantified places, we know what's working, what's not, but in reality, we're still building places that are auto-dominated. So, and that are bad for our health in multiple ways, right? So then, okay, how do I address that, right? And that goes back to this concept of, okay, well, let's show them the value. Let's quantify that value. So like I said, I started focusing on the health side, and really this drew upon multiple methods. So similar to Dr. Armstrong, we use multiple methods to collect data. So this is, part of it is what I call advanced people watching. You're literally at a park and you're trying to annotate all the different behaviors and who's doing the behaviors. We've done mail surveys. I put a picture of the copy machine because I literally had a copy machine in my graduate school apartment where I, copied all sorts of mail questionnaires that I sent out to participants in my dissertation research to try to understand their behaviors. So we do a lot of survey work. Now a lot of that has been done digitalized, thankfully. And then we also started to extract big data, kind of like available data. This wasn't the case, when I started in my work. So the first thing, as I mentioned, we focused on the health piece. And this is a slide that a lot of us use to kind of show like an obvious understanding of the relationship between design and behavior. So we were really trying to kind of figure out, how do you design a place to nudge people to do the thing that is more healthy, right? And so one of the studies that I did in this regard was actually in Shanghai, which is normally where I live. It's just COVID has me here in the suburbs of Boston. So we applied the State of Place framework, that same scoring system, to 3 different neighborhoods in Shanghai. And we were actually able to show that the people that lived in neighborhoods with a above average state of place walked on average 22 more minutes per week. So actually that starts to really add up. And this is, of course, on average. So now we had some health data to kind of spur people to think about why place mattered. But I was also interested in the sense of community piece. And this is the dissertation work that I did, where I looked at malls that had been revitalized into this, kind of cool, walkable, mixed-use setting versus the, old standard mall. How did that influence people's sense of community? And here we go, another. I've never used dads, I guess, to describe this, but I guess that's what this is. Yeah, another conceptual model to kind of understand how this all worked. And there was indeed a relationship between here. But when I started to pull this data together and talk to my friends at that Urban Landscape Conference and those kinds of real estate, investment people, they were like, okay, that's nice, Mariela. That's not going to make a difference in terms of changing how we make decisions about what to invest in. So I started to focus on the economic piece. I did a study with the Brookings Institution that showed that if you had a higher state of place index, you had higher economic value. And then that's really what turned into state of place as it is right now as a software, because we were able to turn that information. We now automatically extract our data using visual machine learning models. You can see it in a really cool dashboard and see like, okay, which blocks have sidewalks, which are missing trees, for example, get this diagnostic, as I mentioned, really understand kind of, again, what's working and what's not. Set priorities as to like which specific urban design features will have the biggest impact on a specific outcome. And then even do like SimCity analysis where you can say, okay, if I make these changes, what's going to be the result of that afterwards? So this was a city in Tigard in Portland where we did that for two different kind of proposals that they had for this redevelopment project. And we were able to show that the more costly project, yes, it was more costly, but would give you a higher value, even from an economic perspective. So it's really about changing people's minds and with data and evidence. It's just another fun project that we did where we just did a little before after with the state of place, just to show how literally a coat of paint could make a huge difference in the score. It's increased by 30 points, not just for the paint, but there were other things. And then, going back to the safety piece, we've also tied state of place to the likelihood of like, is there going to be a traffic collision, and will that result in injury and death, which goes back to the epidemiological link, of course. And there is indeed quite a bit of a difference. And then one of the things that I think drew me to Dr. Armstrong's work was really around COVID and the Black Lives Matter protest that really culminated over the summer. That started to get me working on a project with the city of Philadelphia, where we were really trying to understand this equity piece, right? So we have these COVID results that are killing more Black and brown people. We believe that that's tied to the built environment. Because these are disinvested communities are the same ones with higher, incidences of diabetes and chronic disease. And turns out those are the same comorbidities that COVID preys upon. So how can we quantify these relationships to create more equitable places, right? So this is another conceptual model, way more complicated because with COVID, it's complicated. And we're still kind of piecing through what this looks like right now. And then separately, kind of also on the equity piece, we're working with the city, the Transportation Department of California to understand how, again, design influences how much we drive. That also has a health outcome, of course, because it's tied to greenhouse gas and air quality and things like that. Another one of these. So really, ultimately, we're pulling this all together to essentially quantify the exponential power of good places, all really tied to an underlying reason for health. health, whether it's social health, environmental health, physical health, or mental health. And the last thing I'll share with you is that, Dr. Armstrong talks a little about who. Clearly, we're working a lot with cities and developers, but we're also looking to work directly with people because we think that's another important piece. We want to involve more people in the design process and even in the research process, because that's another way to build more equity in the process. So this is just a little visualization of what we hope the software to be more like an actual sim city where you can kind of drag and drop benches and parks and then be able to see what the new score would be. So that's it. And you guys can find me here for more information.
So thank you for a wonderful presentation. So we had a few questions. So what educational pathway would you recommend for like a future epidemiologist or engineer?
So I'll start with that. I think that if you are interested in epidemiology and you're in high school now, a couple things that are going to be really important for you later on are going to be calculus. Take calculus, enjoy it. It's going to come back because a lot of one of the major techniques that epidemiologists use is survival analysis. And, for me, at least, it had been, more than 10 years since I had actually thought about calculus when I walked into my first semester of graduate school in Epi. And then I was like, oh no, I need to remember this. It's back. So calculus is big. Mathematical statistics. If you can take an AP stats course, if you can take a stats course as soon as you get into undergrad, that's going to sort of start you along the pathway. In general, most sequences are going to have you take 2 to 4 semesters of stats or biostatistics before you move on to the kinds of techniques that we actually use in epi and in health research. Techniques for categorical data analysis, like logistic regression, fitting models with Poisson distributions, things like this. You really are building on semesters or years worth of understanding linear regression first. So start early. But then the other big class that I would recommend is take social science, whether it is sociology or anthropology. It is really incredible, actually, how much of epidemiology is about the social sciences and how much, to what degree the gaps that we have in our knowledge are really about social and behavioral sciences. So, when I think about what's exciting about Dr. Alfonzo's work for epidemiologists is that it helps us get to the intervention. In epi, we're constantly, we're counting cases, we're calculating rates of things, we're thinking in terms of compartmental models in order to understand transmission dynamics. But ultimately, at the end, the goal is to prevent and control disease. Well, in order to prevent and control disease, we have to act, right? We have to develop an intervention. We have to do something. We have to change the environment in some way so that people will be safer. The sort of proto-epidemiologist with John Snow, you've probably, because of COVID, heard the story already, but, he was actually an obstetrician and anesthesiologist who had a theory about malaria cholera, and thought that, he would test this by removing the Broad Street pump handle. And, when he did it, his hypothesis test provided evidence that it actually had been the pump that was spreading the cholera epidemic. And so, in the end, epidemiology, we get to the intervention. But in order to actually intervene, in order to change the environment, in order to change people's behavior, we can't just stay in the world of disease and case counts. We have to think about psychology. We have to think about the architecture. We have to think about sociology. We have to think about culture, right? And so I think that if you're interested in being an epidemiologist, take calc, take stats, you probably want to take some biology, but also pick one or two social behavioral sciences and get a background in that, because that is going to really have a high return on investment once you get to graduate school and once you get postgraduate school and you're actually out there in the field in practice.
Great. I'll just say quickly around engineering, even though that's not my training, I do, of course, teach a lot of engineering students. And so what I suggest to them is don't just focus on data science and traditional engineering subjects, but also look to the social sciences, look to the arts. There's a reason why well-rounded people kind of, I don't know, there's just adds to the way you think about things critically, and maybe the other kinds of factors that you take into account, which isn't often how engineers are taught, because there's just so, I understand because there's quite a lot of very, very difficult subject matter that's very technical. So to bring on something else that's outside of that is sometimes very challenging for students. But I do find from a career perspective, that's only going to bode well, because you do need to communicate what you're doing in the lab, right? You do need to understand how whatever it is you're doing in the lab is going to translate into real life. And in order to do that, you need to understand real people, right? And so a social science approach, in addition to kind of what we call like a data science approach, will ground you in this, in creating these DADs and creating these conceptual frameworks that often aren't as used, at least within the data science field in engineering. So I would absolutely encourage you to do that. One of my favorite classes when I was in undergrad had nothing to do with my field. It was I took an acting class, and I never became an actor, but I think it makes a huge difference in terms of understanding how you communicate. So that was, I don't know, just take something kind of unexpected is what I would say.
I think that's such great advice. I actually was originally a dance major. Like go far afield. It helps you think more broadly. And in general, I mean, I was thinking as you were talking, this is good advice for any field, right? So for any STEM field, for whatever you want to do in life, to take courses that are going to broaden your horizons, not narrow them. Because that's where innovation is going to come from. It's going to come from these transdisciplinary experiences and ideas. And I think that's particularly true in public health. Like I'm not alone among the people that I work with. Each of us has a different area of expertise, but everybody I know in public health is some kind of a polymath, right? I work with physicians who also dabble in data science and the psychology of clinical decision making. Right? I work with biostatisticians who also dabble in sociology, right? Those are the people who really bloom in public health, because ultimately public health is a many, many-sided problem. And you need people who are going to at least be conversational in a whole lot of different ways of thinking about the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's why like all of those different facets of value, they're all from different disciplines, right? Mm-hmm. So every time I go into it's not just, oh, here's another variable. It's like, here's a whole other field and way of measuring and thinking that you need to incorporate into your models and testing.
Every time I add another variable to one of our DAGs, it's like, I have to add another co-investigator, new author on the paper.
Yeah.
Yeah. So our next question is, what is the most frustrating misconception that people have had about your fields?
This is especially prescient with COVID.
Feelings about this. The short version is a year ago when people asked what I did and I said an epidemiologist, they would say, "What's that?" And now no one says, "What's that?" or "What do you do?" But what I notice is that they still don't really understand what epidemiologists do. When a lot of people misunderstand epidemiology and think that it's medicine. And it's not. There are some clinical epidemiologists who are MDs, and there are certainly infectious disease specialists, who are MDs. But actually, most epidemiologists are PhDs, and we're focused on research and understanding and acting on sort of these patterns of disease, not in practicing medicine.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think you got from my story that I fall into not real one category of what I do. And it started with, this supposed schism between psychology and architecture. So I've always sort of been between multiple disciplines. So I'm actually the one kind of pushing back on people in the typical urban planning field to be more broad, to get outside of their silos, to do things in a more transdisciplinary way. The program that I went to at UC Irvine was the School of Social Ecology, which is literally about pulling all of these different relationships together. So what I'm trying to kind of push out in terms of a misconception is it doesn't need to just be this one little slice. Indeed, it has to be all of these other facets of understanding in order to actually do your job well.
Yes. So thank you for both of those answers to the questions. So if anyone has any more questions, you can email them to us and we will forward them to our presenters. So we have two final giveaways. So the first is a Go Build a Hat. And it looks like Andrew Wu won that one. And then our next one is we have a store credit. And it looks like Ashmit Juwan has won that last one. And then we will have one more from the Google form and we will email the winner. So ConnectCon will continue next month with Miss Susan Campbell from the University of Maryland College of Info Studies. If you would like to be informed about more events and videos by our team, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and check out our website at the links in the description. Thank you, Dr. Armstrong, and Dr. Alfonzo for presenting at ConnectCon. Thank you everyone for attending the presentation today. Also, thank you to our alumni, Sarfik Fatnagar, Angeline Zing, and Nishan Oberoi for their help. See you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.